Hey guys, tonight we step into a world of contradictions where silence is mightier than shouting and a scrap of paper could mean more than a sword. You're standing in the hallway of a wooden castle in feudal Japan. The floors creak softly beneath your bare feet. Candles flicker in long paper lanterns, casting shadows on the lacquered walls. You can smell ink, charcoal, the faint bitterness of tea. And oddly, though dawn is only hours away and battle is near, there is no clanging of armor or sharpening of blades. Instead, the room is filled with hushed murmurs, the rustle of robes and the rhythmic brushstrokes of warriors writing poems. The ink is still drying. You probably wouldn't survive this, by the way. Not because of the swords, that's a given, but because of the discipline. You'd blink wrong and dishonor 5 generations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You kneel on a woven tatami mat, stiff from tension, but the samurai beside you shows no such discomfort. His eyes are half-lidded, his hands steady as he writes a death poem, Jisei, in delicate, near-sacred calligraphy. There's something unsettling about how peaceful he looks. The poem is short, only 5 lines, but within it is an entire life, a fleeting reference to snow melting on pine to the smell of plum blossoms, and a final line that alludes quietly, almost playfully, to his own coming death. It's beautiful, it's also terrifying. You're not alone in your confusion. Historians still argue whether these poetic rituals were meant to steal the samurai's nerves or distract them from fear. But one thing is certain, this tradition was no formality. Warriors composed these verses with all the care they gave to choosing their weapons. It was not uncommon to revise a jisei over days, sometimes weeks. Some even composed multiple death poems, not knowing which one would be used. It's easy to think of the samurai as only warriors, battle-hardened, stoic, ruthless. But before they cut through flesh, they cut through silence with words. You'd be surprised how often a general's blade was sheathed beside a calligraphy set. You glance at the shelves. Lined neatly between inkstones and scrolls are volumes of classical Chinese verse. The samurai studied Confucius, but also Li Bai. They practiced swordsmanship by day, but after dinner, they recited couplets under moonlight. In this world, strength isn't just about muscle or technique. It's about restraint, about knowing when to strike and when to write, and knowing above all that your legacy might live on in a line of poetry, not just the record of a victory. Your attention returns to the warrior beside you. He dots the final character of his poem, then bows slightly to the paper as if acknowledging a spirit that now inhabits it. He doesn't read it aloud. He doesn't need to. That poem is for the gods or for no one at all. A breeze slips through the bamboo shutters. The candle flickers. And somewhere far below in the dark, a nightingale sings a reminder that beauty continues even on the eve of destruction. You wonder what you would write if it were your final night. A quick limerick? Probably not. But then again, not everyone's cut out for death poetry. Still, the samurai had a phrase for this moment, mono no, aware the awareness of impermanence. The ache of knowing that even this quiet, even this breath is already slipping away. And in that ache, they found their art. The sword is heavy, but the brush is precise. You hold both in your hands now. Not literally, you're not trained for either, but in spirit you begin to feel the weight of what it meant to be a samurai. Because these men were not just warriors of flesh and blood, they were expected to be warriors of the soul. And that soul, it was sharpened as much in libraries as in battlefields. From a very young age, samurai boys weren't only learning to wield a katana, they were also hunched over wooden desks, practicing their kanji with brushes dipped in black ink, reciting Chinese classics with mouths too small for their meaning. If you thought your school poetry lessons were tough, imagine writing tanka while balancing a short sword at your hip. The noble families hired tutors. These weren't just martial arts masters, but scholars trained in Confucian text poetry and sometimes Buddhist philosophy. Education was considered essential for cultivating a complete warrior, a person who understood life, death, and the subtle shades in between. You were expected to read the Analects, interpret the Book of Songs, and then maybe go split someone in half before dinner. Historians still argue whether all samurai actually practiced poetry or if this was more common among elite warrior families. But what's clear is that poetry was deeply woven into the fabric of their culture. It wasn't a hobby, it was a necessity. You step into a training hall not for swordplay this time, but for writing. A group of boys sits in seiza, straight-backed and silent as an elder dictates a poem from memory. They repeat it not chanting, but whispering like prayer. Then using their brushes, they copy it, not for grades, for honor, for clarity, for discipline. Poetry and calligraphy were also a test of character. One slip of the brush and the whole meaning could change. One uneven stroke and the harmony of the form was ruined. Sound familiar? It's not that different from a duel, really. You only get one chance, one flick of the wrist, one heartbeat of truth. And here's something quirky for you. Some samurai trained themselves to write poetry while holding their katana, claiming it balanced their mind and body. Others would write poems after battle, their hands still trembling from combat, blood seeping through the bandages, using the back of a discarded scroll because they had to get the words out. Who needs therapy when you've got ink and a collapsed lung? The training was grueling, yes, but there was something deeper at play, an emotional literacy. These warriors were taught to name feelings, describe the seasons, honor beauty. And that's not just elegant, it's strategic. A general who understands grief might hesitate before sacrificing troops. A warrior who appreciates moonlight might choose not to burn a village. A soldier who knows how words endure might pause before committing dishonor. That's the quiet power of poetry. You kneel beside one of the boys. He's no older than 10. His brush moves slowly, deliberately, and he's muttering the syllables under his breath. Mountain wind. 1,000 leaves fall at once. Stillness returns. That's his own poem. It's not perfect, but it's raw, real, and his teacher nods just once. That's approval. That's a step toward becoming not just a man, but a samurai. You see, writing verse wasn't just about discipline. It was about leaving a trace of yourself that couldn't be cut down. Swords rust, armor dents, even family names fade. But a poem, if it's good, it echoes. Sometimes that echo is the only thing that survives. You step out of the study hall and into the morning mist. The sky is pale, the color of cold rice paper, and the scent of pine needles sharpens your breath. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster cries like it's trying to start a war. But here under the canopy of cypress trees, it's all stillness. This too is training. The samurai don't just memorize poems, they walk through them. Nature is not a backdrop. It's a classroom. And every leaf, every gust of wind is part of the curriculum. You follow an older warrior now, his sandals brushing through the dew-covered grass. He stops beside a narrow brook and crouches to observe a dragonfly skimming the surface. Then without a word, he pulls out a brush and writes a quick verse on a slip of mulberry paper tucked into his sash. It's something about stillness, wings, and longing. You didn't catch all of it, but that's okay. You weren't meant to. This quiet reverence for nature shaped the heart of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It wasn't just about duty and loyalty. It was also about living in accordance with the impermanence of all things. There's even a word for that bittersweet awareness, mono no aware. The fleeting sadness of cherry blossoms falling, not because they die, but because they are so beautiful in doing so. Historians still argue whether Bushido was a strict code written down or a romanticized ideal that evolved over centuries. But there's little doubt that poetry and nature reinforced its deepest tenets: honor, transience, and readiness to die with grace. That's why cherry blossoms became more than just seasonal decor. They were the soul of the samurai, short-lived exquisite, and doomed to fall at the peak of their beauty. Sound familiar? You pause beneath a blossoming tree. The petals fall like snow, and for a moment you understand. This isn't softness. It's surrender to the moment. This isn't weakness. It's the strength to let go. The samurai weren't obsessed with death. Not really. They were obsessed with awareness, being so fully alive that even dying could be artful. That's why they wrote poems about frogs, cranes, dew, and cicadas. Each creature embodied something they recognized in themselves: fragility, persistence, clarity, or transformation. And yes, sometimes these warriors wrote about battlefields, but more often they wrote about bamboo creaking in the wind or moonlight catching on their swords like silver thread. It wasn't about avoiding violence. It was about giving violence context, anchoring it in a wider world that still spun gently even as blood was spilled. A quirky tidbit for you: some samurai believed certain types of poetry could influence fate. Writing about plum blossoms before spring might bring early warmth. Writing about death could delay it, like calling its name first before it could sneak up on you. And so you begin to realize that poetry wasn't a distraction from their warrior life. It was the frame around it, the thing that made it sacred, the thing that reminded them day after day that even a sharpened blade is just a breath away from silence. As the morning sun cuts through the branches, the old warrior beside you smiles faintly as if to say, "Now you see." And maybe you do. The sky is lighter now, nearly pink, as the first shafts of sunlight cut across the courtyard. But here in the inner chamber of the castle, shadows still reign. And in the deepest one of all, a warrior kneels alone, inkstone. Before him, brush trembling slightly in his hand. He's writing his jisei, his death poem, not because he's dying now, not yet, but because he might be soon. This was tradition. Not every samurai waited until the final breath. Many composed their jisei the night before a battle when their mind was clearest and their body still whole. They believed that to face death one must first greet it in writing. You watch him as he dips his brush. The poem is short, only a few lines, but each one is a meditation, a farewell, a message folded in wind. He writes not to an audience, but to eternity. A typical jisei might read like this: falling blossom, I leave no trace on the earth, only this breeze. It's heartbreakingly simple, but it's also defiant. In a culture where one's legacy could be erased with a dishonorable death, the jisei was a final act of self-definition. Historians still argue whether these poems were always spontaneous or if warriors prepared drafts in advance, kind of like poetic wills. Either way, it wasn't just about pretty language. It was about emotional clarity, dying with a clean mind, a quiet heart. You might think it's eerie, like writing your own eulogy, but to the samurai it was a final duty. The body might fall, but the poem could live. It could be copied, shared, chanted at funerals, even carved into stone. In that way, the warrior would keep breathing long after his voice went still. There's something deeply human about it, isn't there? The desire to leave behind one line, just one that proves you were more than muscle and steel, that you felt something, saw something, knew something worth remembering. And yes, some of the poems are brutal. One samurai facing execution supposedly wrote, "My head falls, yet the blade feels no sorrow, only I do." But others are filled with absurd beauty. One warrior supposedly included a pun about miso soup. Another rhymed his death poem in a way that scandalized the temple priests, proof that even in death some men insisted on humor. You move closer to the kneeling samurai. He's older now. His armor is laid out beside him, each piece polished and still. He finishes the final character of his poem, sets down the brush, and exhales. Not in dread, in peace. He's done what he must. Whether he returns or not, his voice will stay behind. You glance at the scroll again. The ink is still drying. The words shimmer slightly in the morning light. And for a moment you wonder what your own death poem would be. Not to be morbid, but to be honest. What would you leave behind in 17 syllables? The scent of pine fades behind you as you enter another room, quiet, sunlit, and lined with scrolls. This is not a war room. There are no maps or swords here, only paper brushes and the faint scratch of calligraphy. A young samurai sits cross-legged on a woven mat, sleeves rolled back, brows furrowed. He is not writing instructions or orders. He's composing a tanka, a poem of 31 syllables, a whisper of thought strung across 5 lines like beads on silk. His blade rests beside him, gleaming faintly in the morning light. It's not sheathed, but it's still, as if waiting. You sit across from him. He doesn't look up, but he knows you're there. Every warrior should write, he murmurs. It keeps the blood in check. It sounds poetic, but also practical. The samurai believed that a man who could shape beauty in language was more likely to master his own emotions. It wasn't just an art, it was training. Because every battle, especially the ones inside the mind, starts with the breath. And writing poetry forces you to breathe differently, slower, deeper, with intent. You take a brush. The ink glides like river water. You try a line, something about clouds and cold wind, but your hand shakes and the brush snaps awkwardly at the end. The warrior sees it. He chuckles softly. Don't push it. Let the thought carry your hand. Easy for him to say. His poem is already taking shape. A moon, a sword, the scent of camellias, and a final line that leaves just enough room for silence. Historians still argue whether this ritualized calm before battle was about spiritual purification or simply psychological strategy. Maybe both, but there's no doubt it worked. A composed man kills more cleanly than a frenzied one. And here's a quirky bit: some warriors refused to write poems until their hands stopped shaking. If they couldn't make the brush obey, they believed their sword wouldn't either. That's one way to keep anxiety in check. So poetry wasn't just for the night before battle. It was often written in the hour before marching out, when the drums began, when the tension thickened, when the taste of fear started rising like bile in the throat. That's when they wrote, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The words made the difference. The warrior across from you finishes his poem and bows to it, not out of ego, but out of respect for the poem, for the moment, and for the self he's about to let go of. It's not just a poem, it's a mirror. And in it, he sees exactly who he is right now, before the blood and the fire and the forgetting. And maybe that's what poetry is, a way of pausing time even when death is closing in fast. You follow the warrior down a narrow corridor. The floorboards creak with each step, and the light grows warmer. He slides open a paper door with practiced grace. Inside, the world shifts. This isn't a war room either. It's a tea room. The air smells of roasted matcha and cedar. There's a quiet trickle of water somewhere, maybe a small garden fountain just beyond the wall. Tatami mats cover the floor. A low table awaits, not with swords or scrolls, but with a teapot and 2 ceramic cups that look far too delicate to survive even a harsh whisper. You sit. So does he. No one speaks. And then the ritual begins. Every movement, every fold of the cloth, every angle of the teacup, every slow pour of water is deliberate, slow, reverent, like poetry without words. You expected pre-battle shouting, rallying war cries. Instead, you're holding a ceramic bowl in 2 hands, bowing your head and drinking bitterness with humility. This is the shanoyu, the way of tea. And for the samurai, it was more than refreshment, it was a method of composure. See, the tea ceremony wasn't a luxury, it was a form of mindfulness. It reminded warriors to be fully present, to observe details, to control breath, to listen. Some historians still argue whether samurai practiced the tea ritual purely for inner peace, or if it also served as a kind of psychological armor. One thing's clear: stepping into this quiet space before battle allowed them to wash the dust off their minds. And yes, quirky detail time, some warlords built portable tea rooms, tiny traveling shrines of calm so they could hold a ceremony even on the eve of war. Imagine that one moment sipping tea beneath a paper lantern, the next strapping on armor to march into chaos. You lift your teacup again. The rim is slightly cracked. The warrior across from you nods as if to say, "That's the point." Wabi sabi. Beauty in imperfection, strength in wear. This too was a lesson for battle. You don't go imperfect, you go in aware, aware of every weakness, every breath, every trembling edge. That awareness makes you whole. The tea is gone. The moment is sealed. You rise with him lighter somehow, not because you've escaped fear, but because you've faced it without flinching. And as you leave the tea room, the quiet hum of the world returns sharper, clearer, more alive. You're not sure if you're ready for war, but you are present, and that might be enough. The breeze catches your sleeve as you step outside. The garden is bathed in gold now, early sunlight falling through maple leaves, dappling the ground with fire-colored shadows. You hear it before you see it, the flutter, the hush, the soft rain of petals. Cherry blossoms. They drift down slowly like snow with a secret. One lands on your shoulder, another on the tip of your sandal. You don't brush them off. You just stand there feeling how light they are, how temporary. And then you understand why the samurai wrote about them so much. To be a cherry blossom is to be beautiful, fragile, and destined to fall at the moment of perfection. No slow withering, no rot. Just one brief flare of existence and then silence. You spot two warriors beneath a tree. They aren't speaking, just watching the petals fall. One of them holds a slip of paper, a poem. He tucks it into the bark of the tree like an offering. This was common. A warrior might write his thoughts on a morning like this and leave the poem where no one would find it unless they returned alive. Historians still argue whether the obsession with cherry blossoms was philosophical or practical, if it trained the mind to accept death or simply mask the horror with metaphor. Maybe it was both, but either way it worked. And here's your odd detail of the day. Some commanders used cherry blossom season to plan their battles, not just for symbolism, but because the petals falling in great numbers could obscure vision, reduce the range of arrows, and even soften the sounds of marching feet. Beauty as a weapon, nature as camouflage. You crouch beside the base of the tree. There are more papers tucked there, some decades old, faded to near invisibility. Each one a goodbye, each one a fragment of someone who once stood where you now kneel. You read one aloud, barely louder than a breath. "If I fall today, let the blossoms fall with me." We were the same thing. You don't know who wrote it, but somehow it feels familiar, like it could have been yours. The warrior beside you finally speaks. To live as a blossom is to die with dignity. You look up. The tree shakes softly, shedding another wave of petals. And you believe him. The scent of old ink and silk follows you into the barracks. The walls here are simple wooden planks rubbed smooth by countless shoulder scabbards and sleeping mats. But tucked among the armor stands and spears are bundles of parchment, some tightly rolled, others creased from being folded into breastplates. Letters, verses, messages not meant for war, but for memory. You kneel beside one tied with a faded red ribbon. You untie it gently like you're unwrapping someone's breath. The handwriting is neat but rushed. A tanka followed by a line in prose. "If I fall, tell her the plum tree bloomed early this year." You pause. It's not just a poem, it's a love letter. Or maybe a farewell, or maybe both. You start to notice more. Tucked into boots, wrapped around sword hilts, pressed between layers of armor like charms. This wasn't rare, it was expected. Samurai wrote poems to lovers, to ancestors, to unborn children. They tucked them away not for vanity, but for protection, a sort of spiritual armor, a whisper that might reach beyond death. Historians still debate whether these messages were ever read, or if they were meant to remain hidden forever, buried in ash and memory. But sometimes they were found. A general might collect the letters of fallen warriors and return them to families, or bury them in temples, or burn them as offerings. And here's your offbeat fact: some temples kept archives of battlefield poems. Scrolls written by men minutes before death were copied and preserved, curated like sacred scripture. Sometimes the poetry was raw, unfinished, a smudge of blood on the edge. A final character trailed off mid-stroke, and yet those imperfections made them more real. You pick up another letter. This one's addressed to a daughter. She probably never saw it. I walk into wind, but I leave a candle lit for you, little one. It's unbearable, and yet also deeply comforting. You start to understand the samurai wrote not because they were poets, but because they were human. And in the face of a death that could be sudden, brutal, and anonymous, writing gave them a name again, a voice, a path home. Some poems were never found. Others survived centuries, but all of them, at least for a moment, made the world a little softer. The battlefield is quiet. Not silent, there are birds and wind, and the distant creak of armor being adjusted, but quiet in the way a breath is held just before it's released. You stand on a rise overlooking the field, your armor stiff, your palms damp beneath the wrapping of your katana. Then you see them, two warriors stepping out from the opposing lines, not to charge, not to shout, to speak, or rather to recite. Each holds a slip of paper. This is not a myth. In certain duels, especially between respected rivals, it was tradition to exchange poems before drawing blades. Not for show, for clarity, for honor. To acknowledge that the man across from you was not just a target, but a soul. One warrior bows slightly, then speaks first. His voice is calm, almost too soft for this place. The river does not choose whose shadow touches it last. Then silence. The other replies not with a challenge but with verse. Let my blade fall clean, so your name stays clear and win. That's it. No screaming, no taunts, just recognition. Two men meeting in the only language that could hold both respect and regret. You watch as they draw their swords. It's over quickly. It usually is. One kneels. The other stands, blood on his sleeve, but sorrow in his eyes. He walks over to the fallen body, picks up the poem and folds it gently. He tucks it into the warrior's sleeve. Then he whispers something only the wind will hear. Historians still argue how often this happened. Some say it was rare, more a romantic legend than a routine. Others insist the written record supports it, dual poems copied and archived in temple registries. Either way, the practice has left enough traces to haunt the imagination. And here's your quirky note of the night: in one recorded duel, the victor was so moved by his opponent's poem that he built a small shrine to him, a wooden post with the lines carved in, surrounded by bamboo. That shrine still exists. The sword that killed is long gone, but the words remain. You turn back to your side of the field. The samurai near you looks at the sky. He says not to you, but to the horizon. Better to lose cleanly than win with a muddy soul. Then he tucks a slip of paper into his belt. His opponent waits. And once again the poetry begins. You're walking now, not marching, not sneaking, just wandering. The forest path is quiet. Pines tower above you, their long arms reaching toward the mist. Insects drone softly in the underbrush. Somewhere nearby, a stream gurgles over smooth stones. And ahead of you, in a patch of clearing, stands a man. No helmet, no banner, no retinue. Just a threadbare kimono, a traveler's staff, and a scroll case strapped to his back. He's a ronin, a masterless samurai. But this one is different. He doesn't ask for money, doesn't challenge you to a duel. He asks instead, do you have any poems from the fallen? You blink. No, you say, unsure what he means. He nods once, as if he expected that. Then slowly he pulls a scroll from his case and unrolls it. Inside are dozens of small handwritten poems. some neatly inked, others smudged, a few written on scraps of torn cloth. Some contain only 3 lines. Some are unfinished mid-thought. All of them belong to the dead. This man, you realize, doesn't seek revenge. He doesn't even seek redemption. He collects last words. Historians still argue about these types of figures, whether they were real or exaggerated by folklore. But stories abound of wandering ronin who gathered battlefield poems, sometimes from the bodies themselves, and brought them to temples' families or burned them ceremonially at mountain shrines. A few became known as ink monks, dedicating their lives not to war, but to remembering it properly. They didn't want glory. They wanted to preserve the invisible, what had been felt, not just what had been done. Your wandering ronin walks over to a stone, kneels beside it, and places a small paper atop the moss. He lights it with a sliver of charcoal. The flame curls upward like incense. Not all spirits need names, he says, but they all deserve to be remembered. A squirrel scampers across a tree branch overhead. A breeze stirs the ashes. And here's something curious. In some regions of Japan, there are sacred groves said to be quieted by verse. Priests would chant old war poems at night to soothe the unrested dead. Words as lullabies, history as balm. You watch as the ronin wraps his scrolls again, careful not to crease the older ones. You wonder what drives a man to walk hundreds of miles with nothing but the last thoughts of the dying. Then again, maybe you already know. Maybe that's the only way he knows how to survive, not by forgetting, but by carrying the weight of memory folded carefully between pages. And maybe that's what you're doing too. One story at a time. The sea glimmers beyond the cliff edge as you arrive at the outpost. It's a strange mix, half fortress, half library. On the parapets, warriors patrol with bows and spears. But inside, past sliding doors and incense smoke, the walls are lined with books, poetry scrolls, philosophy, even foreign manuscripts. You step through the hall and catch sight of something unexpected, a European envoy, wide-eyed and sunburnt, gripping a fan like a weapon. He's clearly out of his element. 2 samurai sit calmly across from him sipping tea. One gestures politely, offering the envoy a cushion. The other opens a scroll and begins reading, verse not orders. The envoy blinks, then blinks again. Welcome to Japan, sir, where warriors write poetry and wipe blood off their swords before tucking a flower into their sashes. When Europeans first encountered samurai culture, they didn't quite know what to make of it. Early accounts describe them as terrifyingly precise killers, but also shockingly literate. A Portuguese missionary once wrote that many Japanese warriors could quote Chinese classics better than their own priests. Historians still debate how widespread literacy was among the samurai, especially the lower ranks. But among the elite, education was paramount. Knowing how to kill was necessary, but knowing how to think, that was power. You listen as the samurai recites a short poem about mist clinging to the edge of a blade. The envoy frowns, nods uncertainly, and tries to respond with a Latin proverb. The moment is awkward, but also deeply human. It's a cultural chess match, and the samurai are playing an iambic pentameter. Here's a quirky bit for your brain to chew on. Some Japanese castles had designated poetry rooms. Not war rooms, not trophy halls. Poetry rooms. Places to gather and compose, sometimes as a group, sometimes in duels of wit and syllables. Loser buys the sake. Back in the hall, the envoy is beginning to smile. He may not understand the poem, but he understands its rhythm. The samurai offers him a brush, a fresh page. He hesitates, then writes, slowly, carefully. And in that moment, you realize that poetry isn't just for samurai. It's for anyone willing to pause, observe, and say something fragile. Even when the world demands armor, the ground is mud, the air is smoke. The rhythm of battle drums has faded to the sporadic clash of steel and the ragged breath of those still standing. You're in the middle of it now, and somehow, someone is writing. You crouch beside a shallow trench, your hands trembling. Across from you, a wounded samurai leans against a tree, one leg twisted beneath him, his armor cracked, his side blooming red. But he's not crying out. He's not even looking at the wound. He's writing a poem, not carefully, not with calligraphy flourishes or ceremonial grace, just with his finger in the dust beside him. Short strokes, hesitant syllables. But there it is, a tanka forming one breath at a time. Steel sky above me. No one left to hear my voice. Still I write it down. Even if the wind forgets, I will know I did not beg. You freeze, then swallow. This isn't myth. This happened. There are documented cases of samurai composing jisei in the middle of combat, scrawled on scraps of torn banners, etched into wooden shields, even scratched into the dirt beside their bodies. Historians still argue whether these battlefield poems were conscious last acts or instinctive emotional release, but we have the records. A few were copied by witnesses. Some were found later written in charcoal on the backs of armor plates. And here's your unexpected tidbit. Certain elite warriors carried small paper scrolls inside watertight bone tubes strapped to their waists just in case they had time for a final poem. It was like carrying a spiritual flare gun, not for rescue but for remembrance. You crouch closer to the wounded man. He's finished now. He leans back, closes his eyes, a faint smile. He's not afraid, because he's done the one thing that death can't erase. He's made art, and in doing so, he's reminded you this isn't about being brave. It's about being clear. In the middle of pain, in the haze of fear, he's found the sharpest expression of self. No one might read his poem, but he didn't write it to be read. He wrote it to be known by himself. You pick up a nearby shard of wood. Maybe you write something too. Not a masterpiece, just a thought, a truth. Because even when chaos surrounds you, your voice still belongs to you. The bamboo grove is older than memory. You move through it slowly, brushing aside thin green stalks that sway like they're whispering. Each one is straight tall, but not unbreakable. In fact, that's what makes bamboo special. It bends, and only breaks when pushed far enough. You stop when you see it. A message carved into the surface of a thick bamboo stalk, faded and weathered, but still legible. 5 short lines etched not for decoration, but for someone who never came back to read them. The path splits in 3, but I walk only one way. Cracked beneath the snow. Still I do not fall apart until I am no longer needed. It's not a suicide note. It's not a prayer. It's something in between. You start to notice others scattered through the grove, lines of poetry hidden on stalks. Most are overgrown. Some are nearly gone. This place isn't a battlefield. It's a memory field, a forest of whispers. Bamboo had a special place in samurai metaphor. It appeared constantly in their poems, not just for its beauty, but for its symbolism. Strength through flexibility, growth through hollowness, honor in bending but not breaking, and sometimes betrayal. A cracked stalk in a verse could signal fractured loyalty. A split bamboo grove might represent a divided clan. Historians still argue whether these metaphors were universally understood or personal to each poet. Some claim bamboo was used like codey poetic way to send messages in plain sight. Allies would understand. Enemies wouldn't. Here's something quirky for you. In at least one recorded instance, a general used a bamboo poem to issue orders. The poem appeared in a scroll, part of a larger composition, but if you read only the second syllable of every line, a hidden message emerged. A battle plan, delivered in rhyme. Poetry meet espionage. You kneel by one of the thicker stalks, tracing your fingers along the grooves. Someone's knife did this long ago, careful even like a monk copying scripture. You wonder who they were, what they wanted. Maybe they were declaring loyalty, or shame, or just truth. The kind that doesn't need approval. the kind that sits in a forest alone for centuries. The wind rustles, the bamboo sways, and for a moment it sounds like applause. The castle walls are strangely quiet. No shouting, no commands echoing from the watchtowers. Just the soft crunch of gravel beneath your sandals and the occasional flap of a heron's wings overhead. You expected fortifications, trenches, a parade of armed men. Instead, you find a garden, not a lush, flowery one. No, this is a rock garden. Raked gravel, carefully placed stones, and little else. Not even a tree. But somehow it's impossible to look away. And in the center of it, seated cross-legged beside a weathered rake, is the general. You've heard of him. A fierce strategist, undefeated in 6 campaigns. Feared by many, trusted by few. And yet here he is, gently brushing patterns into gravel, like he's sketching clouds. You move closer, but he doesn't look up. Just keeps raking. Line after line. Smooth. Intentional. Still. Then without breaking his rhythm, he speaks. The enemy waits beyond the hills. But first I must solve this. You glance at the pattern. It's mesmerizing. Circles around boulders, waves that seem to shift with every angle. But it's not just art, it's information. This isn't just a meditative practice. It's a diagram, a metaphor, a map. Turns out this general uses his garden to visualize troop movement. The boulders are formations. The rake paths march lines. And the empty spaces, that's where uncertainty lives. Historians still argue whether such gardens were ever used directly for tactical planning, or if this is just a beautiful legend passed through generations. But the idea has persisted for centuries. And here's a curious little fact. One famous warlord supposedly buried his entire military strategy in a garden. Literally. The positioning of each stone corresponded to a district he planned to attack. The placement was a code only those who understood his poetic style could decipher the battle plan. A castle-sized haiku. You crouch near the edge of the sand and watch as the general finishes his pass. He lays down the rake, picks up a small scroll and unfurls it. It's a verse he's written for this moment. Stones do not speak, yet they whisper through silence. I arrange my fate not with fire, but still sand, so no blood stains my thinking. He reads it aloud to no one in particular. Maybe to the wind. Maybe to you. Then rolls the scroll up again, tucks it into his sleeve, and rises. Come, he says. There's work to do. But before he leaves, he smooths over the last few rake marks, as if to say nothing is fixed. Everything can be redrawn, even destiny. You walk the castle corridors in silence, though something feels off. The guards are posted, the banners hang in their usual places, but there's a stillness that hums beneath the surface. A waiting, a whisper withheld. You pass a monk, he bows. You pass a cook. She smiles faintly but says nothing. And then you see him, a samurai dressed not in armor, but in robes. He leans casually against a pillar, a flute tucked under one arm, and a folded poem in his hand. He catches your eye, smiles like you've just stumbled into a joke you're not in on. Because you have. This is a trap, but not the kind with spring-loaded spikes or pits. This one is made of verses. You duck into a nearby chamber. A single candle flickers on the table. On the wall, poems, dozens of them, tacked up like decorations, each written in the same elegant hand. They talk of snowfall, of hunger, of retreat. They paint a picture of a man lost in grief, mourning the futility of war. You would believe it. Anyone would. But this is the brilliance, the ruse. The poet is not a broken warrior. He's a strategist, and his verses, they're bait. Historians still argue how often samurai use poetry as deception, but the concept of utsuroi, transience illusion, was central to their thinking. A warrior who appeared defeated, who recited melancholic verse, might disarm suspicion, invite pity, lower an enemy's guard, And here's your strange little gem. In one battle, a disguised commander posed as a wandering poet for 3 days, composing melancholic verses to entertain his enemies. On the third night, when the guards were drowsy from wine and sympathy, he slipped away and returned with a unit that overwhelmed the camp. The final verse he left behind: I drink your kindness as the tide swells beneath me. Tonight I am gone, but my shadow waits outside barefoot in your garden gate. It was later copied into battle scrolls not for its beauty, but for its cunning. Back in the candlelit room, you notice the walls are thin. Behind one, a sword gleams in the shadows. Behind another, footprints in ash. This isn't a poet's sanctuary. It's a stage, and the performance A faint in 5 lines. You step back uneasy. Not all poems are about peace. Some are just quieter weapons. The sun is high now and the battlefield has quieted, not from peace but from exhaustion. You step carefully among the wounded, the discarded spears, the banners half buried in dust. And then you see it, a young samurai slumped against a broken gate, his breathing shallow, one hand clutching a bloodied cloth at his side. In his other hand is a small scroll. Not a weapon, not a prayer, a poem. He sees you, nods once. Then without any ceremony, he reads it aloud. Not to boast, not to impress, just to make sure the words are heard before they disappear. Even the crow stops to watch my breath leaving me. Tell my brother this. The plum tree he planted bloomed just once and I remembered. You're frozen. Because in this moment, it's so clear he doesn't care who wins this battle. He doesn't care if his name ends up in a history book. What he cares about is being remembered correctly as someone who noticed the plum tree. That's what many of them wanted. Not victory, not glory, just a final line that told the truth. Historians still argue whether this poetic obsession was rooted in religion or just culture, a reflection of Japan's deep connection to nature, death, and expression. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe it was simply that in the face of chaos, poetry offered control, because no one could rewrite your final verse but you. And here's a surprising little gem. Families would often include their ancestors' last poem in shrines, treating it like a sacred relic. In some villages, reciting a warrior's jisei was part of an annual ritual honoring not just the life lost, but the insight captured in 17 syllables. You crouch beside the young samurai. He's still breathing, but only just. He tries to hand you the poem. You take it, carefully, like lifting the edge of a dream. You don't ask for his name. He doesn't offer it, because the poem is the name now. That's what it means to leave behind a line worth remembering. That's what it means to write yourself into history not as a victor, but as a voice. The campfire crackles quietly. You're seated among warriors, some sharpening blades, others sipping hot water from dented cups. But the real action is on paper. Scrolls are being passed around like secret notes in school. Not orders, not maps, poems. You glance over a shoulder and see one. The wind lifts your flag, but it droops at every name whispered in the dark. That's not just poetry. That's psychological warfare. Welcome to the quieter front line where battles are waged with ink and implication. Samurai weren't just warriors. They were in their own way information tacticians. In poetry, that was a weapon too. Before a battle, some commanders would circulate haunting verses through enemy camps. Sometimes dropped from arrows, sometimes sewn into the hems of discarded robes, sometimes whispered by spies posing as beggars. The point wasn't to intimidate outright. It was to unsettle, plant doubt, sow unease. Historians still argue whether these tactics actually tipped battles or if they were simply cultural embellishments added later by chroniclers who loved a good flourish. But several preserved battle records include notations about enemy poems found among tents or morale disturbed by ghost verses. Here's your fringe fact: a few poems were designed as traps. A verse might appear harmless, even beautiful, But if you rearrange the lines, a hidden insult or threat emerged. Kind of like a literary landmine. Soldiers who understood the code might recognize it instantly. Those who didn't, well, they just felt vaguely uneasy. That was the goal. You lean closer to another warrior who's unfolding a silk square. Inside is a short poem embroidered in red thread. We die only once, but shame revives every dusk. Choose your silence now. He laughs softly. The enemy thinks this will scare us. You raise an eyebrow. He adds, it won't. But it did make me think of my mother. So there you go. Even when it didn't break, Will's poetry cracked the surface just enough to let memory slip in, to make men pause, reflect, shudder. And sometimes that pause was all it took. You realize something odd now. Some warriors likely spent more time crafting their message than preparing their armor. Some victories were won not by blood, but by carefully chosen syllables. Because once fear speaks your language, you start listening to it. It's nearly dusk and the camp grows quieter. The clang of hammers fades. The smoke from cook fires thins to drifting ribbons. And here, amid the murmurs of preparation and the quiet tension of nightfall, you notice something small but deliberate tied to the inside of a helmet, a folded piece of paper. You reach for it gently. It's tucked under the leather lining, nearly invisible. You unfold it. There, written in a soft, looping hand, is a love poem. Not a warrior's poem, not a just say. This one is gentler, hungrier, a little clumsy in its honesty. Your voice lingers still, even where arrows will fly. I have tucked you here, just above my left temple, to speak louder than fear does. You glance up. No one claims it. But it doesn't matter. Because there were hundreds, maybe thousands of these. Poems written not by warriors, but for them. From wives, lovers, children, even parents. Hidden in armor between robes tied inside sleeves. Not all were beautiful. Some were rambling. Some bordered on nagging. One preserved scroll now kept in a Kyoto museum includes the line, "If you die, I will never forgive you unless your soul haunts me with kisses." Subtle, no. Effective, undoubtedly. Historians still argue whether these love notes were battlefield talismans or simply comfort objects, but many believe they served as grounding devices. When war stripped everything else away, these tiny poems reminded a samurai why he existed at all. And here's your quirky tidbit: some warriors responded in kind. On the morning before battle, they'd write a new verse to their beloved, tuck it under their belt, and tell a trusted retainer, "If I fall, bring this to her." A few notes made it home. Some were read beside kitchen fires. Others were buried in family altars, recited annually like sutras. You start noticing more, one tucked inside a sandal, another sewn into a sash. A few warriors wear braided cords with tiny silk pouches dangling beneath their armor. Not charms, not coins, verses, not for luck, for connection. Because no matter how stoic, how hardened, or how deadly a samurai was, he was still human. And when the battle roared and the arrow screamed and the blade rose skyward, he wanted something beautiful close to his skin, something worth returning to, or if he didn't return, something that could carry him home in words. The moon is up now, bright and heavy over the black trees, and the road ahead winds through hills shadowed with silence. You're traveling with a group of samurai, but everyone moves a little faster tonight, not out of fear, out of unease. There's a rumor about the region. They say he's somewhere nearby, a man who walks alone, never speaks, leaves no footprints, but always leaves a poem. Not a ghost, not quite, a killer, a masterless samurai, maybe a monk, maybe a myth. They call him the haiku assassin. You raise an eyebrow. Surely not. Surely no one would risk so much attention just for the sake of style. And yet, you pass a torii gate and on the post is a scroll, tied in red twine, ink still fresh. "I waited for you." Breath held inside a teacup. Now the cup is gone. The men beside you freeze. They recognize the style. a simple, chilling poem. 3 lines. No name, but nearby, a man lies slumped beneath a tree, eyes closed, one hand still clutching his sword. No wounds. No blood. Just stillness and a slip of paper tucked into his collar. You don't believe in legends, but this feels too specific, too poetic to be a coincidence. Historians still argue whether such figures actually existed or if this was the result of accumulated folklore warriors transformed into ghost stories over generations. But there were documented killers who left verses behind, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as signatures, sometimes perhaps as acts of remorse. One later 17th century record describes a Ronin who murdered 5 corrupt officials and left a single haiku in the hall. You drink power fast but choke on your own shadow. Let it be your wine. He was never caught. Or maybe he was just not in a way history remembers. Here's your eerie detail for the night. Some temples still preserve anonymous poems written in blood. No signature, just stanzas found at crime scenes carefully blotted onto cloth, now cataloged alongside battle scrolls and sutras. You continue walking. The wind picks up. The branches above tremble faintly. You spot another scrap pinned to the bark of a tree. Not all poems soothe, some slice gently through silence, like footsteps behind. You walk a little faster now, not out of fear, but because the night is deep, and not every poem was written for peace. Some were written for reckoning. Dawn breaks pale and slow over the mountain ridge. The battle is long over. Smoke has cleared, crows have left, and what remains is quiet. You walk between the bodies, not rushing, not afraid, just looking, searching, and you begin to see them, small scrolls, folded slips of paper, even words etched into the dirt with broken arrows. Poems, dozens, maybe hundreds. Some are folded inside sleeves, others hidden beneath helmet ties. A few are pinned directly to the chests of the fallen like final declarations. Some are smudged with blood. Others are water-streaked from the night's rain. But many remain intact, fragile, stubborn survivors of the storm. You kneel beside one body. A tattered note flutters from his grasp. I have no regrets, only this wind and the stars and the way she smiled. You fold it carefully, slide it into your sash, not to steal, but to keep, because someone should, and you're not alone. In the distance, other survivors walk slowly between the dead, gently gathering poems. They do not speak. There's no shouting, no looting, no triumph. Only collection. This too was a tradition. Poems found after battle were sometimes returned to families. Other times they were burned ceremonially at temples, believed to release the final thoughts into the air so the warrior could find peace. Historians still debate the fate of battlefield poetry. Were they archived? Were they memorized? Did the living even read them, or were they simply offered back to the wind? In some regions, a custom developed. Each recovered poem was read aloud by a priest at sunset, not to be judged, not to be corrected, but to be heard, as if even in death a samurai's words still mattered. Here's something curious. In the Edo period, families began sewing small embroidered pouches into their sons' armor, labeled kotoba no ishi, stones of words. Inside a poem, a name, a wish. If the boy fell, the pouch would be buried with him or returned unopened if he lived. You reach a cluster of bodies now. Someone has placed their poems together, forming a ring around a fallen commander. His poem is at the center. We are not the end. Only punctuation marks. The story flows on. You bow your head, not for the man, not for the war, for the words. Because ink, even stained with blood, still lingers longer than steel. The war is over. The years have passed. The armor is rusting now, tucked away in family shrines and dusty museums. The swords are mounted on lacquered walls. But the poems are still here. You walk the quiet paths of a modern Japanese garden, Gravel raked in soft curves, stepping stones set deliberately maple trees leaning gently overhead. In the gift shop, they sell haiku notebooks. On the walking trail, a boy recites basho to his grandfather's syllables, floating like dragonflies. And in a nearby temple, there's a glass case, inside an old scroll, yellow delicate flanked by a wooden placard. This poem was found on a fallen warrior during the 1582 campaign in Koshu. Author unknown. You read it slowly. I leave no blade drawn, only verses in the stream and shadows that fade. Still haunting, still tender, still samurai. You begin to see the echoes everywhere. The cherry blossom festivals where petals drift like old spirits, the calligraphy clubs and school gymnasiums, the love of silence, the reverence for pause, the way a salaryman might spend 10 minutes arranging his bento before eating ritual precision, a touch of poetry in every act. Historians often discuss this continuity, how the values of Bushido discipline, reflection, presence wove their way into Japanese culture not through conquest but through verse. And here's your gentle twist. Many of the screenwriters, manga artists, and anime creators of the 20th and 21st centuries have cited samurai poetry as inspiration. The brooding hero who says little but sees much. The warrior who walks away from battle with a haiku instead of a monologue. That's not cinematic drama. That's historical DNA. Even the modern idea of a quiet protagonist can be traced back to these sword-wielding poets men who believe that words chosen well needed no explanation. You sit on a bench watching the wind move through the reeds. A schoolgirl nearby sketches a single tree branch and writes next to it, I waited for spring. But the plum blooms without me. Still I sit and smile. She doesn't know it yet, but she's part of the lineage now. One more verse in an endless chain, a whisper carried forward. Not all poems end. Some just evolve. The temple is silent and the wood under your feet groans softly as you walk. The incense is faint now, just a breath of cedar and ash, and the walls are lined with scrolls. Thousands of them. This is not a war memorial. It's a sanctuary of words. You're not alone. Others walk here too, heads bowed, fingertips, tracing the edges of ancient paper. A child reads aloud in a whisper. An old woman lights a candle for someone long gone. And above the altar, carved in smooth calligraphy on aged cedar, are 5 characters, Kotoba wa Nokoru. The words remain. These are the final resting places of warrior poems. They were gathered here over centuries, from battlefields, from families, from shrines. Some were burned and recopied, some faded and were reimagined. Some were found folded inside armor, others scribbled in panic or peace or pain. You reach a particular scroll. It's short, barely a sentence. I was here once. Look where the wind carried me. There's no name, no date, just the proof that someone chose to write instead of scream. Historians still argue whether such temples were originally spiritual centers or community archives. But either way, this one lives on, maintained by monks who sweep the floors and dust the scrolls, who recite a different poem each night before bed, not to entertain but to remember. And here's one final strange truth in modern Japan. Some people still leave handwritten haiku in temple walls before exams, wedding surgeries, anytime the future feels uncertain. It's not superstition, it's memory, it's continuity, it's poetry in the face of what can't be controlled. You sit on a small wooden bench near the corner. A monk passes and nods. He offers you a brush, a square of rice paper. No pressure, just a gesture. And after everything, after cherry blossoms, death poems, tea ceremonies, shadow assassins, bamboo messages, and battlefield scrolls, you finally write one yourself. The sword was a pause. The poem, my breath between storms. Still breathing, I write. You place it in the basket with the others. No ceremony, just placement. A breath becoming part of something older. The bell above the temple sounds once deep and low, not to mark an ending, just a transition. You're still there on the temple bench, but your body has softened. The world has slowed. The wind outside hums through the trees like the hush of old scrolls being turned. The candlelight flickers just enough to blur the edge of things, pages, thoughts, memories. The footsteps around you are light now, gentle, like dreams walking. You close your eyes. You are not in battle anymore, not even in history. You're somewhere quieter, still, where poetry flows not as words but as feeling. A quiet breath, a full pause. Maybe you're still holding that brush, or maybe it's a sword. Maybe by now you understand they were never all that different. The samurai practiced poetry not to escape death, but to meet it properly, to walk through the fog with eyes open, to mark each footstep, to be present in beauty even when that beauty was fleeting, especially when it was fleeting. And you've traveled with them, felt the ink dry, watched the blossoms fall, heard the last lines whispered like smoke. So now let yourself exhale. Let the echoes of those verses lull you. You're safe here. Your mind can soften, your breath can slow. The story continues tomorrow. But tonight, let the poem end gently. Let it carry you like a paper boat in still water. Good night, warrior. End of script. Sweet dreams.